28. So shall you turn there, please? 1 Samuel chapter 28 is what we're going to look at now this evening. 1 Samuel 28. I'm actually going to read 2 or 3 verses, and I'm going to start at verse 4 and read through, I think, about verse 7. Then we're going to go into this message, this study tonight. 1 Samuel chapter 28, look beginning with verse 4. We see that the Philistines had strategically gathered themselves together for a war, a battle to be fought against Israel. What else was new, right? Philistines were always fighting with Israelites. They gathered themselves together, and this is going to be a very ferocious and terrible war. In fact, just to let you know ahead of time, doesn't happen in our study tonight, but in chapter 29, we're going to see that Saul dies in this battle. It's a very grim and bleak time for Saul. The Philistines gathered themselves together and came and pitched in Shunem, and Saul gathered all Israel together, and they pitched in Gilboa. This is at the northern part of Israel, and Philistia was at the southern border. So when you think about this, the Philistines had advanced all the way up throughout most all of Israel up to the northern part, and Saul, they've got him backed up into a corner. How in the world could he have allowed that to happen? And we're going to look at that in a few moments. Saul saw the host, it says in verse 5, of the Philistines, and he was afraid, and his heart greatly trembled. When Saul inquired of the Lord answered him not. That's never a good thing when we pray and God doesn't answer us. There's got to be a reason for that. The Lord answered him not, neither by dreams or by Urim. Urim is the Urim and the Thummim, which is used on the breastplate that the priest would wear. And they had the 2 stones that would fall, and it was God's way of answering questions, especially about things like war. So God would not answer Saul by dreams or by Urim and the Thummim. That means by the priest, the lights and perfections, nor by the prophets. And so he's hearing nothing. So what does Saul do? He does the most ridiculous, craziest thing that he could fathom or comprehend or try to suggest doing. He called unto his servants and said, Seek me a woman that hath a familiar spirit, that I may go to her and inquire of her. And his servant said to him, Behold, there is a woman that hath a familiar spirit at Endor. I am titling tonight's study, Saul Visits the Witch at Endor. Now, this is a real witch who had the profession, I guess if you'd want to call it that, of calling upon the dead, the spirits of the dead people. I'm here to tell you at the onset of this message, I don't believe that God allows us to talk to the spirits of the dead. This is something that's evil, as we'll see in this study. But let's go on and look back at chapter 28, beginning with verse 1. Came to pass in those days that the Philistines had gathered their armies together for warfare to fight against Israel. And Achish, who was Achish? Remember that last week we looked at David fleeing to the Philistines. And he befriended Achish, the king of Gath, who gave him a place called Ziklag, where David and his family, his soldiers and his soldiers' families could live for a while. And David ended up, his army, they ended up fighting some enemies to Israel. That's back in the days before internet communication and television and things like that. And so King Achish didn't know who David was fighting. He thought he was fighting Israelites. Why would David use his army to fight against his own people? But that's what Achish thought, and David never corrected him on it, let him think what he wanted to think. But David was actually fighting enemies to Israel. But King Achish thought he was fighting Israelites. So for that reason, King Achish really thought highly of David and thought, if I'm going to attack the Israelites with my army, I'm going to get David and his army to help me. So that's the plan. Look at verse 1. It says, it came to pass in those days that the Philistines gathered their armies together for warfare to fight with Israel. And Achish said to David, see, you're going to see it here. He said to David, know thou assuredly that thou shalt go out with me to battle, thou and thy men. David had backslidden when he left Israel in the first place to flee to the Philistines. He went there to hide from Saul when he should have trusted God. So he backslid. And when one backslids, they end up in a mess. So David is in a terrible predicament here now. He's in an awful mess. David said to Achish, surely thou shalt know what thy servant can do. What did David mean by that? Was David probably hoping, God, please intervene. I need your help now more than ever, for he has found himself in a mess, sure enough, because he had fled to the Philistines. So Achish said to David, therefore will I make you keeper of mine head forever. In other words, he's saying, David, I'm going to let you be my bodyguard. Now, sometimes we'll make our own mess in our own life, and we got to do a lot of praying when we make ourselves into a mess, and we got to hope that God will intervene and clean up that mess for us. So David got himself in a bad situation here, as he had confused King Achish into thinking he was fighting Israelites, when in reality he was fighting enemies of Israelites. The king thought he was fighting Israelites, so he says, David, come on board, help me. David says, how am I going to get out of this? Meanwhile, Saul was in a mess too. Saul was backed into a corner, as I said, as the Philistine army had marched triumphantly throughout Israel, getting ready to attack. So verse 3 says Samuel was dead. Remember that? Back in chapter 25, verse 1. There you see it says that Samuel had died, and the people buried Samuel in a place called Ramah. And the people mourned the death of Samuel. Chapter 25, verse 1. You can see it there. Now, then it goes on and it says here that Saul wasn't all bad. I mean, if you do a contrast of the life between Samuel and Saul, you will see that Samuel was a whole lot better man. The people revered Samuel. Samuel was a God-fearing man. Samuel, ever since his mother Hannah had prayed that he'd be born and dedicated him into the temple, Samuel was a God-fearing man, great leader of Israel. He was the judge of Israel. But then God allowed the people to have what they wanted. Sometimes God allows us to have what we ask for, even if it's not in our best interest, to teach us a lesson. The people wanted a king. God gave them a king. He told them this man is going to give you trouble, and he did. They didn't listen. Now they're paying the consequences, you see here. Saul has got himself backed in the corner, but Saul wasn't all bad. There were some good things about him. For there was a time when Saul had decided that he wanted all witchcraft, all sorcery, all necromancy, I think is the word, how you say it, necromancy, which is speaking to the dead. He wanted all of that to be eliminated throughout Israel. Do away with all the witchcraft. Do away with all of the witches. Saul said, it's evil. Do away with it. Destroy it. Get rid of it. Now, the Philistines, verse 4, as I read a few moments ago, the Philistines had gathered themselves together and came and pitched in Shunem, and Saul gathered Israel together, and they pitched in Gilboa. And when Saul saw the host of the Philistines, word host means army. When he saw the army of the Philistines, he was afraid, and his heart greatly trembled. How? I asked the question a moment ago. I re-ask it now. How did Saul end up in such a predicament? How did he allow the Philistine army to advance all the way up north and have him and the Israelite army backed up into a corner? How could he have allowed that to happen? Because Saul had been wasting all his time for chasing the wrong enemy, chasing David, trying to kill David. David wasn't his enemy anyway. But Saul thought he was, and Saul was spending all his time trying to chase down David, and he let his guard down. And this is what happens when we let our guard down. Satan comes in, and he'll do whatever he can to destroy us and back us up into a corner. Saul let his guard down, and he's backed into a corner, see. As we go on, we find it says in verse 6, when Saul inquired of the Lord, again, as I said a moment ago, the Lord answered him not, neither by dreams, nor by the Urim and the Thummim, the lights and perfections, nor by the prophets. So, by dreams or by the priesthood or by prophets, he got no answers. So Saul said to his servants, seek me a woman that hath a familiar spirit. Now, something's wrong with that. All right, did I not read a moment ago and say that Saul had told the people to rid Israel of all of the witchcraft and sorcery and the witches? He did, but they did not do a thorough cleansing. And there's still some witches, perhaps out hiding in caves somewhere in different places. And he did not eliminate all of them. And Saul kind of figured that as much, and so he knew that there had to be some witches around, and he told them, go find a witch. If God's not going to answer me by way of a dream, if God's not going to answer me by way of the priesthood, if God's not going to answer me by way of a prophet, then find me a witch that I may go to her. Find me one who practices the art of necromancy. Find me a necromancer, which is a person who talks to the dead. Find me one. So, one of his servants, or some of his servants, we find here in the middle part, verse 7, said, behold, there is a woman which hath a familiar spirit at Endor. And she's a witch in a place called Endor. And they said, she practices necromancy. She speaks to the dead. We've heard this. How did they know? Were they secretly going to her? They knew of her somehow. Well, anyway, Saul disguised himself. Why would he waste time and do that? Because Saul was the king of Israel. And the kings dressed and looked like kings, see? He would be dressed in his purple and his robes. So Saul disguised himself, put on other clothing. Maybe he changed his appearance somehow that no one would recognize who he was. And so he goes, he changed his raiment, and he went, and 2 men with him. These 2 men would be bodyguards. And they came to the woman by night, and he said, I pray thee, divine unto me the familiar spirit, and bring me up one of whom I shall name. So he said, I want you, he tells this necromancer, I want you to speak to someone who is dead, speak to their spirit, and bring them up so that I can hear from them. You see, Saul had trusted Samuel at times to guide him. And Samuel did all he could with that king. He tried to help him. He's the one who had anointed him and all. And he tried to help him as much as he's able. But Saul didn't always listen to his wise advice. And now he wants Samuel to speak to him. And Samuel had been dead now by about 2 years. So the woman said unto him, verse 9, behold, thou knowest what Saul hath done, and I have cut off those who have familiar spirits and the wizards out of the land. Wherefore thou layest a snare for my life to cause me to die. The witch says to Saul, not knowing who he is. She didn't know he's King Saul because he disguised himself, put on other clothing. And she said, you know how King Saul had made the decree to do away with all witches, all sorcery, all necromancy. You know that. And now here you are asking me to talk to someone who's been dead and bring up their spirit from the dead. You're asking me to do it? This is a snare. It's a trap. You're just trying to get me in trouble with the king. Saul sware to her, verse 10. He sware to her by the Lord, saying, as the Lord liveth, there shall no punishment happen to thee for this thing. Then the woman said, all right then, you have sworn in the name of God. I'll take that. And she says, whom do you want me to bring up unto thee? And he said, bring me up Samuel. Now, the sorcerers, the necromancers would a lot of times fool the person into thinking that they're actually bringing up a voice of someone from the dead, all for the act of money, and was it real? Is evil? And you're going to find this woman, she's going to be startled in a second or two here. Just hang on with me at what's about to happen. The woman saw Samuel, she cried. That's really just being, the author here is really just being very gentle with the wording here. She really literally screamed. She cried with a loud voice. That's what screaming means. The necromancers or the witches would say magical words which were incantations, and they would repeat them over and over and over and over and over again until it would get to the point that the witch usually would end up in some kind of a trance, as she would lose control of her own thoughts and she would be taken over by evil demons and evil spirits. But here we find she cried with a loud voice because she actually saw Samuel coming up. And then I don't know how, the Bible doesn't explain it, but somehow Saul, who is disguised with this costume he's wearing, she now knows it's Saul, the king. And she says, "Why have you deceived me? For you are Saul. Thou art Saul," it says in verse 12. And the king answered her, and he said, "Be not afraid for what thou sawest." And the woman said unto Saul, "I saw," he said, "What have you seen? What you've called upon Samuel. What have you seen? What have you seen? Don't be afraid of me. I'm not going to punish you. I promise I won't," is what he's telling her. "What have you seen?" She said, "I saw gods." The word gods in the King James is plural, but it actually should be singular, and it's in a little g, and God here can be either the one and only true God, any other God, it can be any kind of a spirit, or it can be a person. That's what the word can mean. So she saw a God coming up, ascending out of the earth. Ascending means coming up out of the earth, not coming down. Now, we always think of heaven as being up and hell as being down. He's ascending up, not coming down. Does that mean that Samuel was not in heaven? Or was it even Samuel to start with? Let's try to tackle this. Look with me. It says in verse 14, "And he said unto her, What form is this man or this God that you see? What form is he of?" And this is what she said. She said, "He's an old man." Now, before Samuel had died, sometime before he had died, he had said in 1 Samuel chapter 12, verse 2, I am old and I am gray-headed. So he was an old man. She said, "I see an old man, and he's covered with a mantle, that is a long coat." And Saul perceived that it must be Samuel, and he stooped with his face to the ground and bowed himself. So how do we explain this? There are several different theories, and no one really understands or knows exactly what happened here. There are different thoughts and theories, and some think that this was a hallucination on the part of the witch. Maybe she had been taking some kind of a potion or something that she had been working up as a witch, and it made her hallucinate. Or maybe she's fallen into a trance as she's making these incantations, these magical words, and the evil spirits have overcome her, and perhaps she's hallucinating. But then we see that Saul saw Samuel too, so that kind of defeats that. Some have thought that maybe it's deception. Maybe it's like all the necromancers would do. They would try to deceive the person who has come to them, asking that they would bring someone up from the dead. And it was always deception. But there again, Saul sees Samuel, so that kind of defeats that purpose. Some have said maybe it was an evil spirit, and that the devil who imitates, Satan can imitate, but he cannot be, Satan can imitate God, but he's not God. He cannot replace God. And that maybe it was the devil, maybe it's some kind of spirits, and the spirits were speaking to Saul in an embodiment of Samuel. And then others believe that it was really Samuel. But then if it was really Samuel, how could a witch bring up someone that belonged to God? How could evil bring up something that's of God? Doesn't make a whole lot of sense, did it? Unless God allowed it to happen. Let's look at it. Boy, this is really kind of tough and deep to look at. But we see that Samuel said to Saul, Why hast thou disquieted me? The word disquieted means disturbed. Samuel said, why have you disturbed me? Now, does that mean that there is such a thing as soul sleep, and that when we die as a saved saint, a child of God, that our body is put in the ground and our soul is in that body, and that soul goes to sleep for a period of time until the resurrection? No. 2 Corinthians 5:8 says to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. The body that's buried in the ground, that body will disintegrate and come to nothing. Nothing but bones. That's all. And the spirit, the soul, is in the presence of God forevermore. So when he said, why have you disquieted me? What apparently must have happened, and it is believed, that God had allowed Samuel's spirit to come from heaven and re-enter into his body, and that body made an appearance post-death unto Saul. You say, well, I've never heard of anything like that, and how could that happen? Look at Jesus in the transfiguration with Moses and Elijah. Elijah never died, Moses did, and Moses' spirit is appearing in his embodiment with Jesus in the transfiguration. So some people believe, and I'm inclined to believe this, whether I'm right or wrong, it's really irrelevant. We'll find out one day. But I'm inclined to believe, like some do, that this was a real embodiment of Samuel appearing to Saul at the allowance of God, not to appease the devil, but God was going to allow it to happen to reveal something to Saul, because he was not speaking to him in the natural way that God would speak to people in those days. So it says here in verse 15, Samuel said to Saul, why hast thou disquieted me or disturbed me to bring me up? And Saul answered and said, I am sore distressed. He said, for the Philistines make war against me. And answered me no, and God is departed from me, and answereth me no more, neither by prophets nor by dreams. Therefore I have called unto thee, that thou mayest make known unto me what I shall do. So Saul asked for it. He's going to get it. Samuel's going to tell him what's about to happen, and it's not going to be pleasing to Saul's ears. Saul is backed up in the corner. Samuel speaks to him and said, wherefore then thou dost ask me, verse 16, seeing the Lord is departed from thee, and has become thine enemy, and the Lord hath done to him as he had spoken to me. All you got to do is go back and look at chapter 15, and you will see this. There was a time when God told Saul for Israel to fight the Amalekites, destroy all of them, including all the animals and the king. Saul took the king as his trophy and kept some of the good animals and cooked them to eat. And that angered God. And God said, for that, Saul, I will sever your control of the kingdom one day, and it will fall into the hands of David. David is going to be the king. Now, that really happened. And Samuel is reminding Saul of this. Now, go to verse 19. Moreover, the Lord will also deliver Israel with thee into the hand of the Philistines, and tomorrow shalt thy sons be with me. You know what that says? God said through Samuel unto Saul that you're going to go into battle tomorrow against that mighty Philistine army, and you tomorrow, sometime tomorrow, you and your sons, you're going to be with me. All right, does that mean that they're going to heaven? Or they're going to hell? We'll try to look at that in a moment too. It really probably just means that as my body is buried in the ground, you'll die tomorrow too, and your bodies will be buried in the ground. But anyway, we see it says in verse 20, Saul, when he heard this, was elated with joy? No. He fell straightway along the earth and was sore afraid. Saul had gone to the witch by night in the darkness of night, and he left the way greatly disturbed. Reminds me of another man who went to someone by night, that being Nicodemus, who went to Jesus by night. But he did not go away greatly disturbed. He went away saved because he found the light of the world in that darkness. But in contrast here, Saul found darkness, and he left in darkness, and he is greatly troubled. He is greatly troubled. And it says the woman, she had, verse 26, Saul fell down Now we're going to find that the witch becomes like a mother figure. Really. The witch, that evil, despicable, and nasty and horrible witch, is going to come to Saul like a mother figure. Honestly, she is. See, back in those days, if you're going to see a witch and a necromancer and ask them to speak to someone from the dead for you, you would fast before you go see them. So Saul had not eaten anything all day long. So the woman came to Saul, it says in verse 21, and saw that he was sore troubled. And she said unto him, Behold, thine handmaid hath obeyed thy voice, and I have put my life into your hand, and have hearkened unto your words which thou spakest unto me. Now therefore I pray thee, hearken thou unto the voice of thine handmaid now, and let me set a morsel of bread before thee, and eat. It's just like a mother or grandmother, even though this was a witch. It's hard to think of a witch being anything pleasant, but still it's like a mother to somebody's hungry and want to make sure you give them something to eat. She offers some bread. She said that you may have strength and you may go your way, but verse 23 says he refused. He didn't want to eat anything. He refused and said, I will not eat. But his servants pled with him. They begged and they said, Saul, you got to eat something. Come on now, you've got to eat. So his servants, they arose from the earth or they compelled him, and he hearkened unto their voice. He arose from the earth and sat upon the bed. And the woman had a fat calf. That tells us something interesting. This really is amazing to me. She must have made a killing off of her art of necromancy, because people didn't have a fat calf unless they had wealth. This woman must have been raking in the money. She must have deceived a lot of people through this witchcraft, because she had a fat calf. It reminds me of the story of the prodigal son, as the father killed the fat calf, remember, for the son who had come home. So not only people with means and people who had money had a fat calf, and so she killed a fat calf. It wasn't just bread that she was going to give Saul here. She had a fat calf killed. She hasted, killed it, took flour, kneaded it, and did bake unleavened bread, the flat bread. Didn't put the dough in it because she didn't have time to wait. And she brought it before Saul and before his servants, and they did eat. Then they rose up and went away that night. Now listen to me. In 1 Samuel chapter 9, Saul fed Samuel. And when Saul fed Samuel, this meal is similar to that meal. And when Saul fed Samuel, or when Samuel fed Saul, rather. Let me get it right. Samuel fed Saul. And it is the last meal Saul ate before he became king. Here, a witch feeds him. And it's the last meal he would eat before he would die. You hear these stories about prisoners that are on death row and their last meal. You know, the government will give them whatever they ask for their last meal. And I'm going to read 2 or 3. It's really interesting. You ought to look it up. You ought to Google it sometime and see. Serial killer John Wayne Gacy was put to death in Illinois by lethal injection at the age of 52 in May of 1994. The killer clown was sentenced to death for the rape and 33 counts of murder. For his last meal, John Wayne Gacy requested 12 fried shrimp, a bucket of original recipe KFC, French fries, and a pound of strawberries. You remember Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma bombing, the American terrorist behind the Oklahoma City building, which killed 168 people. He was put to death in Indiana by lethal injection at the age of 33. For his last meal, McVeigh requested 2 pints of mint chocolate chip ice cream. That's all he wanted. Ted Bundy, you've heard of him, one of the most notorious serial killers in American history, was put to death in Florida by an electric chair at the age of 43 in 1989. He declined a special meal. So he's given the traditional meal, a steak, cooked medium rare, eggs over easy, hash browns, toast and butter, jelly, milk, and juice. But this one tops it all. A man by the name of Victor Figueroa was tried and convicted of murder in federal court for his crimes. He was sentenced to death by hanging in March of 1963. And he was put to death at the age of 28. They said, what in the world do you want? You can have on your last meal anything you want to eat. What will it be? He asked for a plate with one single olive and the pit in it. That's all he wanted. So, he wasn't very hungry, I guess so. But you think about it. This was the last meal Saul ate before he would die. Suppose we found out we were going to die tomorrow, and we could have anything in all this world to eat. What would we choose? What would we want to eat? Have you ever thought about that? But here's the thing, we don't know when we're going to die. Sometimes we may have a general idea if we're sick, but we don't know when. So we need to make sure that we know. So that brings me to the question as I conclude this Bible study tonight. Is Saul in heaven today? I don't know. I can't answer that. It's not for me. I'm not the judge. God decides these things. Some people have debated that. Some say Saul's in hell. Some say he's in heaven. How does anyone know? As God has divinely told them. There are some good things about Saul. There are some bad things about King Saul. One thing it says that in verse 19 of chapter 28, remember that? Look at the middle part of verse 19. Samuel has said to Saul, thy sons tomorrow shalt thou sons be with me. One of his sons was Jonathan. And Jonathan was a good, righteous man. It is believed that when Jonathan would die, he went to heaven to be with God. So does that mean Saul is in heaven, as Jonathan probably would be? Or is it talking about the realm of the dead? No one really knows or fully can comprehend. And only God can determine or know if a person's going to go to heaven or if a person's going to go to hell. It says in 1 Samuel 16, verse 7, man looketh on the outward appearance, but God looketh on the heart. Only God knows what's in the heart. And we can't make that determination, that judgment on anyone. We just got to make sure that we know the Lord and that we're ready and not turn our backs on him like Saul did. Let us go to the Lord in prayer.